Legacy overhead. That is what Jared Keller called me during our very first virtual town hall meeting. I was 49, sitting at my desk finishing a monthly validation log for our clinical test kits when his face popped onto the shared feed. Jared was 30, with a tan that looked like it came from a bottle and a haircut he probably selected by searching for alpha male executive on the internet. The chief financial officer had introduced him as a strategic operations consultant, which everyone in the lab knew was just corporate speak for a hatchet man brought in to slice salaries. Jared smiled, showing off teeth that were so white they looked blue under the office lights. He announced that he was here to streamline our workflow, drive cross-functional efficiency, and eliminate legacy process redundancies. As he spoke, his eyes seemed to scan the grid of employee faces, looking for the oldest targets. I did not move or change expression. I simply clicked save on the compliance folder I had spent 10 years building, compressed it, named it Backyard Gardening Tips, and copied it onto a secure private drive. I had seen too many corporate downsizings to trust a guy who used words like synergy and bandwidth as punctuation marks. I was the registered laboratory director for Bradshaw Biotech, a clinical diagnostic firm that processed blood panels and genetic screens for major hospital systems. My role was not just administrative. Under federal law, specifically the Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments of 1988, codified under 42 U.S.C. 263A, every facility performing clinical testing on human specimens must have a licensed laboratory director who holds the ultimate legal responsibility for the lab operations. I was the person registered on our CLIA certificate. My credentials, my medical board license, and my clinical experience were what allowed Bradshaw Biotech to legally operate. Without my signature, they could not run a single diagnostic test, print a patient report, or ship a package of reagents to our buyers. By the afternoon of Jared's first week, I overheard him in the break room, talking to a pair of junior compliance assistants. He was laughing, telling them that the company needed to phase out its boomer infrastructure to make room for agile scaling. I was 49, not a baby boomer, but to a 30-year-old who thought business began with the invention of the iPhone, anyone who did not use social media templates for work was an antique. Jared then called an all-hands meeting in the open bullpen. He projected a slide deck that looked like a vocabulary test for a business school exam, filled with terms like decentralized accountability hubs and lean operational ecosystems. The interns and the younger hires nodded along like they were listening to a prophet. Jared paced the room, pointing at the slides. He said that some of our team members, particularly those holding legacy roles, would have their functions reassessed to align with our new lean strategy. He looked right at me when he said it, thanking me for my historical contributions. I did not say a word. I just gave him a polite nod. It was the same look a hunter gives when he watches a target walk straight toward a hidden trap. That evening I stayed late. The office was quiet, and I wanted to make sure everything was in order. I logged into the federal CMS portal and verified my active credentials. Everything was in place: my certification, my laboratory director registration, and my licensing PIN were all tied directly to my personal name and biological profile. I then opened my desk drawer and pulled out my original employment contract from 10 years ago. I flipped to Section 7C, a clause I had negotiated myself when the company was still small and desperate for a certified director. It was a clause that none of the current executives had ever bothered to read. The clause stated that in the event of involuntary termination, all company-paid licensing responsibilities and regulatory certifications held in my name would be considered null and void, and my credentials would be formally rescinded from the National Registry within 48 hours of my contract nullification. Jared did not know it, but he was looking at a man who held the key to the entire ignition system of Bradshaw Biotech. If he turned the key the wrong way, the engine would explode. On Tuesday morning, I arrived to find that Jared had hung a poster near the break room. It said that compliance does not equal progress in a bold red font. It was clear that he wanted to make things uncomfortable for the senior staff. Later that day, he announced that everyone in the department would have to re-interview for their jobs. He called it an alignment audit. He said it was an exciting opportunity for us to pitch our value to the new organization. One by one, my colleagues went into the glass conference room. The younger analysts came out smiling, saying that Jared was a breath of fresh air. I knew that the air they were breathing was coming from a toxic environment. When it was my turn, I did not bring a printed resume or a list of projects. I brought a notebook and sat down in front of him. Jared did not even look up from his laptop for the first 2 minutes. He typed rapidly, likely sending messages on Slack, before finally closing the screen halfway. He looked at me and said that while he valued my long history with the firm, the company was transitioning to a model that did not require a dedicated compliance manager at my salary bracket. I nodded and waited for him to finish. He pulled up a draft of the new org chart on a monitor and showed me that my position was marked as open for transition with my name crossed out. In the comment section of the digital file, it said that these duties could be managed downstream by the junior staff. To Jared, downstream meant dumping regulatory oversight onto a 22-year-old intern who did not know the difference between a federal statute and a company policy. I did not argue. I just kept my smile steady. The trap was set and Jared was stepping right into the middle of it. I walked back to my desk and opened the clinical compliance dashboard. It was a database I had built from scratch 8 years ago to track our regulatory requirements. It managed 43 separate licenses and certifications, ranging from State Department of Health permits to federal biohazard handling clearances. Every single one of them was linked to my name as the certifying director. I exported a final copy of the registration logs, encrypted the file, and sent it to my personal email address under the subject line Kitchen Renovation Plans. After deleting the sent history, I sat back and watched the lab technicians work. They had no idea that their entire operation was balanced on a thin wire. That afternoon, Jared called a meeting to announce that my daily duties would be transferred to Mia, a marketing intern who had been with the company for 3 months. Mia was a nice kid, but she thought the FDA was a government agency that designed lunchroom health posters. Jared explained that this move would allow the department to be more agile. He told me that my new assignment would be to assist the logistics team by reorganizing the archived records in the basement storage room. He said it would give me a foundational understanding of the company's roots. I asked him if my administrative access to the federal licensing portal would remain active during this transition. Jared blinked, looking confused by the question, and said that he had already instructed I to route those permissions to Mia to avoid any workflow blockages. He said I would not need them anymore. I did not debate the decision. I simply walked down the hall to a secondary terminal, logged in using my personal master administrator credentials, and restricted the access rights of the main portal. If I was being pushed out, I was not going to leave the security codes behind for amateurs to play with. I passed Jared's glass office later that afternoon. He was laughing with the CFO, pointing at a whiteboard covered in diagram arrows and buzzwords. He did not notice me, but I could see the confidence in his posture. He thought he had successfully managed out the old weight. He did not realize that the old weight was the only pillar holding up the roof. On Wednesday morning, I arrived to find that I had been locked out of the clinical databases. When I tried to log in, a red screen popped up telling me that my permissions had been revoked and that I needed to contact my supervisor. I sent an email to Jared asking for clarification, but he did not reply. I called HR, and the representative told me that all inquiries regarding system access now had to go through my department manager. Jared had completely cut off my ability to monitor the lab systems. For the next 3 days, I spent my hours in the basement, moving boxes of old paper records and listening to the hum of the ventilation shafts. The storage room was cold, with concrete walls and rows of dusty steel shelves holding documents from the early 2000s. While carrying a stack of files, I ran into Arthur, a senior facilities engineer, who had been with Bradshaw Biotech since the beginning. He told me how they had built the first clean room with a $50,000 loan and a lot of sweat, and how the original management group actually cared about scientific accuracy. Now, he said the place felt like it was run by marketers who did not know the difference between a pipette and a printer cartridge. It was the perfect place to wait. Above me, Jared was busy telling the executive board how much money he was saving by cutting redundant personnel. He sent out a weekly email blast highlighting the optimization of compliance management. He did not understand that clinical compliance is not something you can optimize with a spreadsheet. It is a legal mandate. On Friday, I took a long lunch break and walked to a notary office on Monroe Street. I sat in a small room and signed a document titled Voluntary Relinquishment of Laboratory Eye Directorship. The notary stamped the paper, and I tucked it into my pocket. It was the formal notification that would sever my legal connection to Bradshaw Biotech. I was ready. Monday morning arrived, and the air in the office felt heavy. Everyone knew that Jared's changes were reaching their final stage. At 10:00 a.m., he called a meeting in the open bullpen. He stood at the front of the room, wearing a blue blazer and no tie, and did his usual hand gestures to gather our attention. He said that to maintain our competitive edge, the company had to make some difficult structural decisions. He then announced that my position as laboratory director had been eliminated, effective immediately. The room went quiet. A few of the older technicians looked at me with concern, while the younger analysts stared at the floor. I stood up, picked up my notebook, and walked toward the HR representatives who were standing by the door. They handed me a blue folder containing the termination agreement. I opened it, verified that it was an involuntary layoff, and signed it with a single stroke of my pen. I told them I required a physical printed copy of the signed agreement before I left the building. The HR representative tried to tell me that everything would be sent digitally, but I insisted. I stood there until they printed it and handed it to me. I walked out of the building at 11:15 a.m., carrying my folder and my personal belongings. The moment I crossed the threshold, the 48-hour countdown in Section 7C began. Jared thought he had just cleaned up the books. He had no idea he had just pulled the pin on a grenade. I went home, made a pot of coffee, and sat at my kitchen table. I opened my laptop and scanned the printed termination agreement to ensure the date and timestamps were clear. I then drafted a formal letter to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, the federal agency that oversees the CLIA program. I attached my notarized relinquishment document and the printed copy of my involuntary termination papers. In the letter, I stated that effective immediately, I was no longer the laboratory director for Bradshaw Biotech, and that all regulatory responsibility for the facility under CLIA certificate number 23D10455582 was officially terminated. I hit send, and the digital notice was logged in the Federal Registry. Under the CLIA regulations, specifically 42 CFR 493, a clinical laboratory cannot operate without a qualified director. The CMS digital notification system was highly automated. Once my submittal went through, the system sent confirmation messages to the regional CMS office and immediately flagged our laboratory status to the national Medicare and Medicaid billing databases. The moment the registry is updated to show that a laboratory has no director, the facility certificate of compliance is automatically suspended. Any test run during a suspension is considered invalid, and billing Medicare or private insurance for those tests is a federal crime under the healthcare fraud statutes. Furthermore, shipping diagnostic specimens across state lines without a valid CLIA certificate violates interstate commerce laws. I knew the regulatory machine would take a day to process the update, but once it did, it would move with the speed of an avalanche. I had spent 10 years playing by the rules, and I knew exactly how those same rules could freeze a multi-million-dollar operation in an instant. On Tuesday, I stayed home and worked on my garden. I did not check my work email, and I kept my phone on silent. I knew the office would still be running on momentum, unaware of the cliff they were approaching. Jared was probably holding another meeting to celebrate his efficiency savings. On Wednesday morning, the storm finally hit. I woke up at 8:00 a.m. and checked my personal email. A former colleague from the lab, Fiona, had sent a message to my private address. She asked if I was doing okay and mentioned that the lab was having some strange system errors. The lab testing equipment was flashing local warnings about a missing laboratory director signature key, and the junior analysts were running around trying to reboot the servers, thinking it was just a local network glitch. They had spent 3 hours checking cables and testing the internet connection before they realized the block was coming from the federal portal. I smiled and deleted the email. At 9:30 a.m., the procurement department at Bradshaw Biotech tried to release a shipment of 500 clinical testing kits to MedTech Solutions, one of their largest hospital clients. The kits were used for urgent oncology screening. When the logistics coordinator tried to print the shipping manifests, the software blocked the transaction. The carrier system had automatically checked the national CLIA database and found that Bradshaw Biotech's status had been updated to suspended. The error message on the screen was clear. Shipping entity is not authorized to distribute clinical products due to regulatory suspension. The logistics coordinator immediately called Mia, who had no idea what a CLIA certificate was. Mia told him to try restarting the computer and that it was probably a database syncing delay. By 11 a.m., the laboratory's internal tracking dashboard began to display red alert flags. The automated API that connected our testing equipment to the federal reporting portal began to fail. The portal returned a rejection code indicating that the certifying officer credentials had been revoked. The lab technicians could not log their results, and the system was blocking them from verifying patient data. Jared walked into the lab, holding a coffee cup, and asked why the output numbers were flatlining on the operations monitor. Mia told him that there was a minor software glitch and that IT was looking into it. She said they would just override the contact information in the system to fix it. Fiona, who was standing nearby, tried to explain the reality of the situation to Jared. She told him that the system was not experiencing a glitch. She explained that the federal database was rejecting the reports because Louis Vance was no longer listed as the laboratory director. She said that a CLIA license is not a standard login account that can be changed by an IT technician. It is a legal authorization tied to a specific individual's medical qualifications and board certification. She told him that to update the laboratory director, the company had to submit a formal application to CMS, including the credentials of a new qualified director, and that the approval process usually took between 6 to 8 weeks. Jared looked at her, his smile disappearing, and asked why nobody had managed this transfer before I left. Fiona looked at him and said that Louis was the only person who held the required qualifications, and that Jared had eliminated the position without finding a replacement. Jared stood there, his face turning pale, while the red lights on the dashboard continued to flash. He was beginning to realize that the spreadsheet he used to run his operations did not have a column for federal law. Jared went back to his office and tried to log into the CMS portal using the credentials I had left behind. The screen immediately locked him out. Because I had restricted the access parameters before I left, the system flagged his unauthorized attempt as a security breach, blocked the office IP address, and sent an automated alert to the federal compliance inspectors. Jared called the CMS help desk, but the operator informed him that due to the active suspension of the laboratory certificate, all support was restricted to the registered director of record. Since my name had been removed and no new director had been approved, there was no one who could legally speak for the facility. By 2 p.m. on Wednesday, the legal department at Bradshaw Biotech received an urgent notification from MedTech Solutions. The client was demanding to know why their oncology screen reports had not been delivered. They pointed out that under their contract, any delay in reporting that exceeded 24 hours would result in a penalty of $50,000 per day, and that they had the right to terminate the agreement if the laboratory remained non-compliant for more than 48 hours. The company's second-largest client, Biopharm Labs, sent a similar notice regarding their clinical trial samples. The director of operations at MedTech Solutions called Jared directly and demanded to know what was happening. Jared tried to lie, saying it was a routine software upgrade, but the client cut him off, saying that their own compliance team had checked the federal registry and saw that Bradshaw Biotech's CLIA license was suspended. By Thursday afternoon, the customer service department was in complete chaos. The phones were ringing continuously, and the sales representatives sat at their desks with worried expressions, unable to answer the calls. Hospital administrators were demanding updates on critical cancer screening panels scheduled for patients who had operations on Monday. The customer service manager tried to explain the situation, But the clients were not interested in administrative restructuring. The financial cost of Jared's efficiency plan was starting to grow rapidly. On Thursday morning, the situation escalated. The company's email server was flooded with messages from sales representatives who were being told by vendors that they could not supply raw chemical reagents. The vendors were legally barred from selling regulated lab materials to a suspended facility. The production line came to a halt. Jared called an emergency meeting with HR and the legal team. He asked if they could simply reinstate my credentials temporarily while they searched for a new director. The legal counsel looked at him like he was crazy. She explained that my credentials could not be turned on and off like a light switch. She pointed out that Section 7C of my contract had officially activated the moment they fired me, and that I had already filed the paperwork to remove my name from their facility. She told them that any attempt to use my electronic signature on clinical reports now would constitute federal forgery under California Penal Code, Section 470, and healthcare fraud, which carried a prison sentence. Jared asked if they could hire a temporary director from a local university. The HR manager explained that the credentialing process for a new laboratory director required a background check, verification of medical board standing, and a formal review by the State Department of Health, which could not be rushed. She said they had contacted several local pathologists, but none of them were willing to take on the liability of a suspended laboratory without a full audit of the facility's records, which would take weeks. The company was stuck. They were running out of time, and their clients were preparing to walk away. On Friday morning, the final blow arrived. At 10 late a.m., 3 inspectors from the Department of Health and Human Services arrived at the facility for a random inspection. I had known the window for this annual inspection was approaching, which was why I had finalized my departure when I did. The inspectors walked into the lobby, showed their badges, and asked to see the laboratory director. The receptionist, who had been instructed to tell visitors that the director was unavailable, hesitated and called the executive suite. Jared ran down to the lobby, his suit jacket wrinkled and his face covered in sweat. He tried to explain to the inspectors that the laboratory was undergoing a temporary administrative restructuring, and that the director was currently out of the office. The lead inspector looked at him and said that under federal law, they could not conduct an inspection of a clinical facility without the registered director or a certified designee present. She asked Jared if he was a board-certified pathologist. Jared admitted he was not. The inspector then informed him that because the facility was operating without a certified director, they were in violation of 42 U.S.C. 263A, and that she was issuing an immediate cease and desist order. She gave them 2 hours to clear the testing areas and lock the doors. The lab was officially shut down. Monday morning brought the arrival of Reginald Bradshaw, the founder and CEO of the company. He had been on a 2-week vacation in Monaco, and he had ignored the urgent messages from the office until he landed in New York. He walked into the building at 8:30 a.m. and was met by the head of legal and the HR director. They spent 30 minutes explaining the situation to him. Reginald's face turned red as he listened. He walked straight into the operations room, where Jared was sitting at his small desk, staring at a blank spreadsheet. Reginald did not raise his voice. He simply told Jared to pack his things and leave the building. Jared tried to argue that his strategy would have saved the company $200,000 in overhead. But Reginald cut him off, pointing out that the shutdown had already cost the company $1,500,000 in penalties and lost client contracts. Jared was escorted out of the building by security, his box of belongings in his arms. The efficiency expert had optimized himself right out of a job. Reginald then instructed his assistant, Simon, to contact me. At 11 a.m., my phone rang. It was Simon, who sounded like he was about to cry. He said that Reginald wanted to speak with me and asked if I could come into the office for an emergency meeting. I was sitting on my back patio, drinking a fresh cup of coffee and listening to the birds in the yard when I took the call. I told Simon that I was busy with my garden but that I could review an email proposal, if they had one. Within 30 minutes, an email arrived from Reginald's personal address. It contained an offer for a consulting agreement. They wanted me to return as a temporary director for 6 months at a salary of $150,000, plus a bonus of $50,000 once the CLIA suspension was lifted. The contract included a strict confidentiality agreement that would prevent me from speaking to the media or any competitors about the situation. I read the proposal and laughed. They still did not understand that they could not buy their way out of a federal regulatory violation. I drafted a reply. I told Reginald that I appreciated the offer, but that I had no interest in returning to a facility that had been managed into a regulatory shutdown. I attached a copy of my signed termination agreement, highlighting Section 7C, and a screenshot of the CMS portal showing that the license status was listed as suspended. I added that I had already accepted a position with Aegis Diagnostics, a new clinical laboratory firm that was expanding its operations in the region. I signed my name and hit send. 3 weeks later, the industry news outlet reported that Aegis Diagnostics had secured the clinical testing contracts for both MedTech Solutions and Biopharm Labs. The clients had terminated their agreements with Bradshaw Biotech due to non-performance and had moved their business to our firm. I was hired as the Director of Clinical Compliance at Aegis, with a salary that was 30% higher than my old one, and a corner office that looked out over the city. My new office had large windows with a view of the harbor, and the cleanroom facilities were equipped with the latest diagnostic technology. At Aegis, the management team actually understood that compliance is the foundation of a clinical laboratory, not a redundant expense. They held weekly integration meetings where the technical team and the administration worked together to maintain high-quality standards. Bradshaw Biotech never recovered from the shutdown. The federal fines and the loss of their major clients forced them to declare bankruptcy within 6 months. The building was eventually sold and the equipment was auctioned off. I sometimes drive past the old office on my way to work. The sign on the building has been removed and the windows are dark. It is a quiet reminder of what happens when a company decides to treat its core regulatory compliance as legacy overhead. I kept the yellow sticky note from my old desk, the one that had my license number printed on it. I pinned it to my new monitor at Aegis Diagnostics. It is a reminder that in the world of clinical testing, the spreadsheets do not run the lab, the licenses do. The new managers can talk about agility all they want, but at the end of the day, you cannot operate without the person who holds the key to the door.